What would you do if the very man who owned you, tortured you, and treated you as less than human became the target of your secret revenge? This is not a question pulled from fiction. It is the opening to one of America's cruelest and most hidden tales of suffering, cruelty, and vengeance. A story buried in whispers, forgotten by history books, yet lingering like a shadow in the soil where blood once soaked the earth. Tonight, you and I will walk into that darkness. But I warn you, this is not just a story about slavery or about cruelty. This is a descent into the human mind when broken, when cornered, and when pushed so far into pain that only revenge becomes the answer. Imagine a young girl, taken from the innocence of her childhood, stripped of her name, her freedom, her dignity. To her master, she was not a child, she was property. To him, she was not human, she was a possession. He owned her body, her labor, her very breath. And for years, she endured his rage, his punishments, and his violations. Most souls would break under that kind of torment. Many did, but hers did not. Her soul hardened, sharp as glass, silently cutting its way toward a fate her master could never imagine. This is not a quick story. This is not a tale of sudden rebellion. No, this is a slow, methodical unraveling. A master who believed himself untouchable, and a girl who learned that the only weapon stronger than his whip was patience. Each day she pretended. Each day she obeyed. Each day she lowered her eyes, whispering, "Yes, master." While inside, she was writing his death sentence, and here's the haunting part. Her revenge was not fast. It was not a knife in the night or a strike of anger. It was slow, deliberate, stretched across years. She watched him suffer. She watched him weaken. She watched him lose the very power he had once wielded over her. This is America's darkest revenge story, not because of the violence of the master, but because of the chilling brilliance of the slave girl who destroyed him piece by piece. What you're about to hear is more than history. It is a reflection of what happens when cruelty is left unchecked, when evil believes itself eternal, and when a victim refuses to remain a victim any longer. This is a story of pain, but it is also a story of power. It is about one girl, nameless in the records of time, who became more than a survivor. She became the shadow behind her master's downfall. By the end of this journey, you will be left with a question. Was her act justice, or was it simply another act of cruelty in a world already poisoned by suffering? I will not give you the answer. Instead, I will take you into her life, her torment, and her vengeance, and let you decide for yourself. So lean closer. Feel the silence of those fields, the creak of the master's house, the weight of chains that clinked against young skin. Because this story is not dead. It still breathes. And tonight, you will hear it as it was meant to be told, raw, unflinching, and unforgettable. The world she was born into was a world of chains. America in the early 1800s was draped in contradictions, nations built on promises of liberty, yet rooted in the enslavement of millions. To the free men, the fields were wealth. To the enslaved, the fields were prisons without walls. Plantations stretched endlessly across the horizon, their soil rich but soaked in sweat and blood. And within those fields, countless lives withered in silence, treated as tools, not souls. This was not just labor, it was domination. Masters were kings in their own territories, wielding unchecked power. They could beat, starve, or kill a slave without consequence. The law protected the oppressor, not the oppressed. Churches spoke of morality, yet turned blind eyes to the shackles that clinked outside their walls. It was a society that dressed itself in civility while feeding on cruelty. Into this unforgiving world was thrown a young girl. She was barely old enough to know what freedom meant before it was ripped from her. Her name, Evelyn as we shall call her, was not her own. Her master gave her that name, as if even her identity belonged to him. Once, she may have had a different name whispered by her mother, spoken in a softer tongue. But that name was stripped away, buried with the family she was torn from, leaving only Evelyn, the property of a man she would learn to fear. At first, she was simply a child, small, fragile, her eyes wide with innocence. She played in the dirt with other children, singing songs passed down through whispers of memory. songs of a homeland she would never see. But the world did not let her stay a child for long. Childhood for her was a fleeting spark, extinguished by the harshness of the whip, the endless work, and the cruelty of the man who claimed her. She carried water until her arms ached. She picked cotton until her fingers bled. She learned quickly that any mistake, any hesitation could bring pain. But worse than the work, worse than the hunger, was the fear. Fear of the footsteps outside the cabin at night. Fear of the master's voice when it called her name. Fear that each day might bring something worse than the last. And yet, within this fragile girl was a spark that would not die. Even as she was beaten, even as she was broken down, her mind did not shatter. She learned to endure. She learned to hide her thoughts behind lowered eyes. She learned that silence could be her weapon and patience her shield. The plantation was her cage, but within its bars she began to watch. She watched how the overseers barked orders, how the master strutted with his cane, how the house servants carried whispers from room to room. She noticed patterns, when the master was drunk, when he was sick, when he was careless. These small details were seeds planted in her memory, though she did not yet know what they would grow into. The world of chains was designed to strip away humanity, to crush resistance before it could be born. But in Evelyn, the chains did not kill the spirit, they forged it. Every lash hardened her resolve. Every night of tears became another layer of steel around her heart. She could not yet name what she was feeling, but deep within, the soil of revenge was being tilled. What made this world so terrifying was not just its cruelty, it was its normalcy. The suffering of slaves was the background noise of America. Masters walked proudly, convinced their power was eternal. Slaves toiled silent, their pain unseen. But beneath that silence, a storm was building. Evelyn's life was proof that even in the deepest despair, resistance can take root. She had been born into a world of chains, but one day she would turn those very chains into a weapon. The master was a man who lived off fear. He was not simply cruel. He was deliberate, calculated, and proud of it. To him, cruelty was not a failing, it was power. He strutted across the plantation as though it were his kingdom, every crack of his whip a declaration of ownership, every scream he caused a reminder of his control. He believed himself untouchable, protected by wealth, law, and the silent obedience of those beneath him. His name mattered little, because he was not unique. There were many like him, wealthy plantation owners who fed on the suffering of others, but for Evelyn he was more than a master. He was the storm that swallowed her youth, the shadow that lingered over every waking moment. He was the face of every nightmare she endured, and he relished it. He was a man of contradictions. To visitors he appeared polished, dressed in fine coats, his speech smooth and charming. To those he owned, he was a tyrant whose rage could ignite without warning. If he was pleased, the lash might rest. If he was angered, flesh would tear. If he was bored, he would invent ways to remind his slaves that they were nothing. Evelyn, young and vulnerable, became one of his obsessions. For years, she bore the weight of his cruelty. His punishments were not reserved for mistakes. They were weapons of dominance. A dropped bucket, a moment of hesitation, even the simple act of looking at him the wrong way could earn her a strike. His punishments were designed not only to hurt, but to humiliate. He wanted her to fear him, but he also wanted her to break, to accept that she was nothing more than his property. And yet, she did not break. Outwardly, she obeyed. She lowered her eyes, she whispered, "Yes, master." She endured the blows. But inside, a different story was being written. With each lash of the whip, her hatred sharpened. With each humiliation, her resolve grew stronger. He was enslaving her body, but unknowingly he was freeing her mind from fear. The master's cruelty went beyond labor and punishment. He was a man who believed ownership gave him rights to every part of her existence. Nights were the worst. The silence of the cabin offered no protection. His footsteps in the dark meant terror was near. Evelyn learned that pain was not the only weapon he carried. There was degradation, violation, and the relentless reminder that she belonged to him. This is where her transformation began. For a long time she was a victim. She cried quietly into her hands, praying for rescue that would never come. But as the years stretched on, something changed. She stopped hoping for someone to save her. She began to realize no one was coming, and with that realization came a shift. If she could not be saved, then perhaps she could do the saving. Not of her own freedom, not yet, but of her own soul. She began to see him differently. No longer a god, no longer an unshakable figure of power. She began to see him as flesh, as blood, as a man who could be hurt, weakened, destroyed. Her hatred became focus. Her suffering became fuel. Every time he struck her, she was not weakened. She was reminded of why she could never forgive. Every cruel act was another nail in the coffin she was silently building for him. To the outside world, she was still his obedient slave. But within, her mind had already declared war. She studied him not with fear, but with the quiet eyes of a predator waiting for the perfect moment. He was still her master, but his reign was already beginning to crack, though he did not yet know it. The master's cruelty shaped her, but it also doomed him. In his arrogance, he believed he had total control. In reality, his cruelty planted the very seed of his destruction. Evelyn's body remained in chains, but her spirit was sharpening into a blade. And one day, that blade would cut deeper than any whip he ever held. The turning point did not come with a single lash, nor a single night of torment. It came slowly, almost invisibly, like a shadow creeping across the floor. Evelyn had lived long enough under the master's cruelty to know one truth. No one was coming to save her. Not God, not neighbors, not even whispers of freedom. Hope of rescue had withered, but in its place something else took root. Clarity. If no one would save her, then she must save herself. And the only way to do that was not through escape, but through vengeance. At first, it was just a thought, fragile and fleeting, a whisper in her mind she dared not speak aloud. Revenge was dangerous. Revenge was impossible. But revenge was also intoxicating. Each time the master struck her, the thought returned, stronger, sharper. She began to imagine him not as an untouchable figure of terror, but as a man with weaknesses. A man who could bleed, a man who could suffer, a man who could die. So Evelyn began to watch. She became an observer of his life, memorizing details that others overlooked. She noticed how he always demanded his meals at the same hour, how he preferred his wine slightly warmed by the fire, how he favored certain dishes over others. She observed when he drank too much, when he stumbled through the halls, when his voice slurred and his arrogance was dulled by alcohol. She noticed when he coughed, when his body showed the first signs of frailty, though he pretended he was still invincible. She also learned his temper. She knew the tone of voice that meant he was seconds away from violence. She learned which of his moods made him careless, when his guard was down. She understood that his cruelty was not just habit, it was also vulnerability. He needed control like he needed air, and one day she realized she could suffocate him with his own needs. This was not rebellion in the open. Open rebellion was suicide. She had seen men whipped to death for less, women sold away for daring to resist. Her path would not be loud. It would not be quick. It would be silent, patient, and invisible. She could not overpower him with strength, but she could outlast him with cunning. She could become the shadow he never saw coming. At night, when she lay on the cabin floor, listening to the wind creep through the cracks in the wood, she imagined it. She imagined him weak, frail, coughing blood into his hands. She imagined him calling her name not with command, but with fear. She imagined herself standing over him, no longer the victim, but the executioner. These thoughts became her refuge. Where others prayed for freedom, she prayed for his suffering. The seed of revenge was growing inside her, watered by every blow, every humiliation, every scar. It was no longer just an idea, it was a purpose. The master had given her nothing but pain. In return, she would give him death. But not just death. Death would be too easy, too merciful. She wanted him to feel what she had felt. Helplessness, dread, the slow torture of knowing you are powerless. She wanted to kill him not with a strike, but with time. This was the moment she stopped being just a slave in chains. The chains were still on her wrists, the whip still in his hand, but in her mind she was already free. Free to plan, free to imagine. Free to hate without fear. The master had unknowingly forged his own executioner. Every day he lived, every act of cruelty he inflicted, only sharpened the blade of her resolve. Evelyn was no longer waiting for rescue. She was waiting for the right moment, and when it came, she would not hesitate. The thought of revenge was no longer enough. A seed without water cannot grow, and Evelyn knew she needed more than anger to destroy the man who owned her. She needed knowledge. Knowledge was dangerous. Slaves were forbidden to read, forbidden to learn anything that might give them power. But Evelyn learned in silence, absorbing scraps of wisdom that others overlooked. On the plantation there was a healer, an older woman who knew the secrets of roots, herbs, and tinctures. To the master she was useful because she could treat sickness, heal wounds, and keep the enslaved alive long enough to work another day. But to Evelyn she was something more, a doorway to possibility. She watched her closely, noting how a bitter leaf could cure a cough, how a crushed root could bring down a fever, how certain plants, if taken in too large a dose, could cause weakness, vomiting, or even death. The knowledge was never given freely. It could not be. Asking questions was dangerous, showing curiosity even more so. But Evelyn had patience. She fetched water, gathered firewood, ground herbs in a mortar. She listened when no one thought she was listening. She memorized the smells, the textures, the reactions. Each fragment became another piece of a puzzle she was building in secret. The idea began to crystallize. Her master would not fall to a sudden strike. That would be too obvious, too risky. But what if his own body could be turned against him? What if every meal, every drink, carried within it the smallest fragment of his undoing? He would not suspect. He would not see it coming. He would grow weaker and weaker still, and no one would ever suspect the quiet girl who served at his table. This was not a fantasy anymore. This was a plan. Evelyn understood the danger. If caught, she would not only die, she would die in agony, made an example to terrify others. The master would burn her alive, hang her body for the crows, and laugh as her screams echoed across the fields. But fear no longer held her. Death itself did not frighten her. What frightened her was the thought of living another lifetime under his cruelty, and so the risk became her courage. She began testing small ideas, watching how herbs mixed, how flavors could be hidden in stew, how bitterness could be masked by wine. She learned which plants left no trace, which could weaken slowly without drawing suspicion. She imagined the master sipping his drink, unaware that his strength was slipping away with every swallow. She pictured his confusion when his body betrayed him, his arrogance dissolving into fear. There was a twisted beauty in the idea. He had taught her patience through pain. Now she would turn that patience into a weapon sharper than any blade. The whip had left scars across her back, but she would leave scars across his soul, scars carved by dread, by weakness, by the slow realization that he was dying, and nothing could stop it. Revenge was no longer just a thought. It was a science, a ritual, a hidden fire smoldering in her heart. Each day she served him with lowered eyes, her voice soft, her hands obedient. But behind the mask of servitude, she was preparing the very ground for his grave. And still, she felt no guilt. Why should she? He had stolen her childhood, her body, her very humanity. Now she would steal from him the one thing he valued most: his power. He believed himself immortal in his dominion. She would remind him he was mortal, frail, and no different from the lives he crushed beneath his boots. The plan was in place. All that remained was the execution. Evelyn knew it would take time, weeks, months, perhaps years, but she had learned to wait. She had already endured more than most could survive. Waiting was her strength, and so she sharpened her silence into a blade and prepared to strike, not once but over and over, until her master's empire of cruelty crumbled into dust. She had learned to hide everything, her thoughts, her fury, the minute changes she forced into the master's life. When the first small dose slipped into his cup, it felt less like a crime and more like inevitability. She moved with the practiced calm of someone who had survived too many storms. The tray balanced, the smile measured, the soft sir that never reached the eyes. He reached for the cup as he always had, taking comfort in ritual. The world rewarded him for routine, and she used that reward against him. At first, the changes were almost laughable in their subtlety. He coughed more frequently after long dinners, a dry rasp that he dismissed with a wave of his hand and a forced laugh. He blamed a chill, blamed the weather, blamed the horses, anything but the quiet girl who polished the silver and refilled his glass. He complained to no one. Pride kept him silent. Arrogance kept him believing he could not be undone by small things. That arrogance was a veil she knew how to pull aside. She watched every reaction. She watched how he squinted at the ledger, how his hand trembled as he poured brandy, how his step faltered coming down the stairs. She catalogued these moments the way she once catalogued the master's mood. The times when his temper flared, the times when he slept late, the times when he dictated orders with an unsteady voice. Each tiny failure in his body mocked the empire he had built. Each cough was a chisel stroke on a statue he thought immortal. There were nights she lay awake imagining the delicious cruelty of the plan. She was not reveling in death for its own sake. She was reveling in the shift of power. The master who had made her kneel would now need help to rise. The master who had commanded floods of labor would now depend on others to light his fire. The balance would tilt and she would watch it, silent and cold. Still, the poisoning, if that is what you call it, was not an act of blind hatred. It was measured as careful as any ritual born of pain. She watched for signs, feeling every pang of hesitation as a test of her resolve. When he grew feverish one week and refused to eat the stew, she learned restraint. To force the plan through arrogance could mean discovery. When the second month passed and his strength did not collapse, she saved her breath and folded her anger into patience. She had time. Time, after all, had been the master's weapon for so long. The household began to whisper. Quiet, meaningless things at first. That the master was under the weather, that his skin looked sallow, that he had been seen coughing at dawn. Whispers spread like tinder, but they found no flame. His status shielded him still. He would not be questioned in public. No physician from the town would say aloud what a field hand might have guessed. The plantation's machinery continued to grind. Cotton still needed picking, ledgers needed balancing. The world obeyed the schedule that had always protected him. But in the small corners where slaves moved unseen, the moment thinned. Those closest to him, maids, cooks, stable boys, began to murmur about the change in his temperament. He grew paranoid, snapping at servants who had done nothing. He accused a groom of stealing when the groom had only returned a saddle. He flung plates in anger, not because food was cold, but because he could not stand the sensation of being weak. Evelyn watched him with a sort of scientific horror, a ruler measuring deterioration, a ledger of human frailty. And then the master grew afraid. Fear crept into him like a foreign language he could not pass. He paced the halls at night, fingers pressed to his chest as if to slow the traitorous beat. He demanded remedies, concoctions, prayers, anything to restore the illusion of invincibility. He visited the doctor from town, who pronounced nothing more than a weakness and advised rest. That pronouncement, so bland, so polite, was the laughter of a civilization that had never known justice. Evelyn learned to be careful of triumph. The sight of him hunched at the window, watching the fields with eyes suddenly small and listless, filled her with a complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. She had wanted him to suffer, yes, but the human cruelty of watching a life waste away was not wholly clean. His breaths came ragged, his nights were fevered. When he cried out after a nightmare, she felt a brief, almost guilty pang. But guilt did not last. It could not overpower a life's worth of pain. A turning point arrived on a rain-soaked evening when the master, who had for years stormed through the house with bluster and command, could not make his hand steady enough to sign a letter. He tapped the pen against the desk and declared it blotted, though no blot remained. He cursed the ink, cursed the parchment, cursed the damned rain. The servants watched, silent and uncertain, as the man who had once carved orders into the lives of others now flailed against a world indifferent to his suffering. Rumors began to travel beyond the house. Traders at the nearby crossroads noticed his absence from the market. A minister noted his pallor in the pew, but the world remained largely indifferent. The plantation's wheels kept turning. Men still drove oxen into the mud. Women still mended shirts by lamplight. Evelyn moved through these motions like a shadow, present, unseen, every gesture an act of normalcy that hid her intent. She kept a ledger too, but it was not of accounts. She logged his symptoms in her head, the cadence of his coughing, the times his skin flushed with fever. She noted the way he forgot a name, then recovered it with a tremulous pride. She watched how his anger changed shape, from violent to petty, from savage to suspicious. Each entry was a step toward a conclusion she had promised herself years before. The slow death was a cruel teacher. It taught her patience and the perverse art of watching. It taught her that vengeance did not always sing in one loud note. Sometimes it whispered, and the whisper, repeated enough times, became an anthem. She tended to the plan the way she once tended the master's horse, quietly, with care, and with an eye always on the next small movement that might reveal the end. And all the while, the fields hummed, the overseers barked, the world pretended business as usual. The master sipped his drink, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, that with every swallow, his rein slipped further from his fingers. The master was changing, and everyone in the household could feel it. Once he had been a man whose voice filled the halls with command, whose stride echoed with certainty. Now he moved like a shadow of himself, thin, shivering, angry at the betrayal of his own body. To the outside world he was still the master, a man of land, wealth, and power. But behind the closed doors of his plantation house he was unraveling. The decline was not sudden. It crept in stages, like a disease with a mind of its own, clawing at him piece by piece. His appetite faltered. Meals he once devoured with greed now sat half-finished, the rich food he adored turning his stomach. His hands shook as he lifted his fork, and the veins along his temples pulsed with effort at tasks that once came easily. He dismissed these weaknesses, pretending they were temporary, but his pride only deepened his misery. By day, he lashed out more frequently. The smallest mistake, a scuff on his boots, a poorly lit fire, a servant too slow to respond, drew violent eruptions of anger. The whip cracked more often, and his voice carried venom that surpassed even his old cruelty. But Evelyn knew what the others did not. These outbursts were not signs of strength, but symptoms of desperation. His cruelty had become the armor he wore against his terror, and she, silent and patient, was the unseen architect of every tremor in his hand, every fever that made him sweat through the night. At night, the arrogance peeled away. Evelyn often passed by his chambers and heard the restless pacing, the muttered curses, the rasp of coughing that seemed to scrape his lungs raw. Sometimes she heard him whispering prayers, words she had never before imagined would pass his lips. He begged for health, for strength, for relief from the curse he could not name. Yet in the morning he emerged again, face flushed, eyes blazing, pretending the night had been nothing but a dream. The servant spoke in hushed voices now, avoiding his gaze, afraid of his sudden moods. They exchanged worried glances when he stumbled down the staircase or forgot the names of men he had known for years. Some suspected the hand of God, others whispered of witchcraft, but no one dared voice suspicion against Evelyn. She was still the obedient girl, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, her service unbroken. No one could see the fire burning behind her calm exterior. Evelyn herself moved through this world like a phantom. Each day, she presented herself as she always had, carrying trays, tending to his demands, fetching his medicine with quiet precision. But beneath the mask of servitude was a mind that ticked with cold calculation. She adjusted the doses carefully, watching his decline as a gardener watches the slow withering of a poisoned tree. Too much too soon and questions would rise. Too little, and the plan would lose momentum. Balance was everything. She felt no remorse when his strength faltered. She remembered too clearly the sting of the whip, the nights of abuse, the years of being treated less than human. Every cough, every moment of weakness was not only his punishment, but her reclamation. Yet the satisfaction was never loud, never careless. It was a quiet thing, buried beneath years of practiced silence. Weeks turned to months, and the once formidable man became frail. His broad shoulders slumped, his booming voice cracked into hoarse barks, his steps slowed to shuffles across the polished wood floors. Still he tried to project command. He summoned overseers to his study, speaking with trembling authority, dictating orders that no longer carried the same weight. Even they began to notice. Behind their respectful nods lingered something dangerous. Pity, and pity was a humiliation he could not bear. The more his body betrayed him, the more he clung to cruelty. One evening when Evelyn brought his supper, he hurled the plate against the wall because the broth was lukewarm. The shards scattered across the floor, and for a moment he looked almost victorious, as if he had reclaimed some measure of dominance. Evelyn knelt, gathered the fragments, and murmured, "Yes, master," as if nothing had changed. But inside she savored the truth. The outburst was hollow, the roar of a lion with broken teeth. His paranoia deepened. He accused the cook of poisoning him, though no evidence existed. He fired 2 stable boys for imagined disobedience. He locked away wine he once drank freely, convinced that enemies circled him unseen. But his arrogance remained a blindfold. He never once considered Evelyn, the quiet girl who moved so invisibly through his world, as the source of his torment. There was symbolism in the decline. The chains that bound Evelyn's wrists during punishments, the chains that had defined her life, were mirrored in his invisible captivity. His body had become the prison. His strength, once a weapon against her, was now shackled by her secret hand. She carried food to him as she always had, but it was he who had become enslaved, to her timing, her doses, her plan. One night, as thunder rolled across the fields, Evelyn stood in the shadows of the hallway, listening to his cries. He begged for mercy, not from her, not from any servant, but from a God he had long mocked. He wept, his voice breaking with fear. For a moment Evelyn felt the strangest flicker of something almost like pity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the memory of her own nights filled with tears he had ignored. His power was rotting as surely as his body. The empire he had built with blood and chains now rested on crumbling foundations. And Evelyn, still outwardly nothing more than a servant girl, was the silent hand guiding him toward his grave. The house that once shook with his authority now echoed with his decline. The overseers whispered, the servants waited, and Evelyn watched, patient, unrelenting, as the slow death tightened its grip. The master's body was already a ruin when the night of reckoning came. His hair, once a thick mane of pride, had thinned into wisps clinging desperately to his skull. His skin carried the waxen pallor of sickness, stretched too tightly over bones that seemed sharper by the day. Even his voice, once a booming thunder that shook the plantation, had thinned to a rasp that carried no more weight than a dying ember. And still, he clung to life. He had become paranoid beyond reason. Locks on doors were checked twice, candles burned through the night to banish shadows, and food was tasted cautiously, though always too late to matter. The servants obeyed his frantic demands, but behind their bowed heads their silence was not respect, it was waiting. They knew something was happening, though none could name it. The master was failing, and the house itself seemed to know it. The walls, once alive with his fury, now swallowed the hollow coughs and moans of a man circling the edge of death. Evelyn had waited long enough. She had watched the decline stretch across years, measured each tremor and each night of fever. She had carried the secret of her vengeance like a stone in her chest, patient and unyielding. But now, as the master lay in bed, his body trembling and his breath shallow, she knew the time had come to close the chapter. Revenge had been slow, deliberate, drawn out like the suffering he had inflicted. But tonight, there would be no more patience. Tonight she would deliver the final strike. The storm outside seemed to conspire with her intent. Rain lashed against the shutters, wind howled through the cracks, and thunder rolled across the fields like the drums of some distant war. Evelyn entered his chamber with a tray, broth, a goblet of wine, and a small vial hidden in the folds of her apron. Her footsteps made no sound on the wooden floor. She moved like a shadow, like the embodiment of inevitability. The master turned his head weakly as she entered. His eyes, once sharp with cruelty, were now clouded with desperation. He coughed violently, reaching for the cup before she had even set it down. His lips trembled as he tried to form a command, but the words dissolved into a wheeze. He hated her silence, but he feared it even more. "Wine," he croaked, voice breaking. "Bring me my wine." Evelyn obeyed as she always had. She poured carefully, the crimson liquid swirling in the cup like blood. From her apron, her fingers released a single drop of the concoction she had prepared. Stronger than the doses before, it was a finality, a poison not meant to weaken but to end. She stirred it with a practiced hand, her expression never shifting, her voice never breaking its mask of servitude. She offered him the cup, her head bowed. He snatched it with trembling fingers, spilling some onto the sheets in his haste. He drank greedily, desperate for comfort, for control, for anything that might remind him of the power he once wielded. The wine slid down his throat, and for a moment, silence filled the room. Then it began. At first, it was a tightening in his chest, a sudden gasp that seemed like another cough. But soon his body convulsed, his face twisting in agony. He dropped the cup, the crimson liquid spilling across the floorboards like a wound. His hands clawed at the sheets, at his throat, at the air itself. His voice broke into screams that cracked and faltered, echoing through the chamber like the cries of a dying animal. Evelyn did not move. She stood at the foot of the bed, her posture calm, her eyes fixed on him with a stillness that was colder than hate. She had no pity, no fear, no hesitation. She watched the man who had broken her for years writhe and choke on his own arrogance. He looked at her then, eyes wide with realization, not suspicion, not paranoia, but certainty. In those final moments he knew. He saw her for what she was. Not a servant, not a victim, but the executioner he had created with his own cruelty. He gasped, reaching out a trembling hand toward her. "You," he rasped, the word torn from his lungs like a confession. But no more followed. His body shook violently, then collapsed into stillness. The storm outside roared, thunder shaking the windows as if nature itself marked the passing. The master was dead. Evelyn stood in the silence, her chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. She felt no rush of triumph, no overwhelming wave of relief. Instead, what she felt was heavier, darker, the stillness of completion. The cycle was over, the balance restored, but it left her with an emptiness she could not name. Years of pain had brought her to this moment, and now that it had arrived, there was no going back. She turned from the body without a word. The spilled wine soaked into the floor, mingling with the storm's echoes. The house, once filled with cruelty, seemed suddenly quiet, like the breath after a scream. She left the chamber with the same silent grace she had entered, leaving behind not just a corpse, but an era. For Evelyn, this was not just revenge. It was judgment, and the judgment had been carried out. The master's death did not arrive quietly, no matter how Evelyn had planned it. His screams in those final moments had echoed through the plantation house, rattling the servants and sending whispers darting from corridor to corridor. By the time the silence fell, thick, unnatural, suffocating, everyone knew something had happened. The overseer was the first to arrive, boots pounding up the staircase, face pale with alarm. Behind him came two house servants, hesitant, wide-eyed, clutching each other's arms as though they were entering the chamber of a ghost. They found the master sprawled across his bed, his mouth slack, his eyes open but lifeless, the sheets twisted from his convulsions. The shattered cup on the floor gleamed wet in the lamplight, the red wine pooling across the boards like spilled blood. The overseer froze. His lips moved as if to speak, but no sound came. Finally, he muttered, "God help us," before rushing to the window and throwing it open as though air could banish the weight of death. The house servants did not move. They bowed their heads, whispering prayers that were half gratitude, half fear. News spread quickly. By dawn, the entire plantation was humming with rumor. Field hands exchanged glances, their hoes and baskets momentarily forgotten. Some believed the master had been struck down by God's wrath, a punishment for years of cruelty. Others whispered of curses, dark spirits, and the restless dead. No one dared say aloud what many were secretly thinking, that someone among them had done what the heavens had delayed. Evelyn remained a shadow in the storm. She moved through the halls as she always had, calm and obedient, offering help when asked, stepping aside when needed. She bowed her head when the overseer demanded answers, her eyes lowered when he barked questions. Did she bring him his last drink? Did she see him suffer? Did she notice anyone else enter the room? She answered with perfect submission, her voice steady, her words simple. She gave them nothing, neither suspicion nor absolution. The doctor from town was summoned. He examined the body, prodding with cold fingers, his face drawn and grave. After a long silence, he declared the master's death the result of a sudden seizure of the heart. He wrote it plainly, as if the explanation could sweep away the screams that still echoed in the servants' ears. The overseer nodded, grateful for the simplicity of the lie. No one wanted the scandal of a deeper truth, but whispers refused to die. The servants exchanged furtive glances. The field hands muttered as they bent to their work. A few swore they had seen shadows moving in the hall that night. Others claimed to have heard the master's cries and the sound of a woman's voice speaking calm words in the storm. The truth hung in the air like smoke. Everyone could smell it, but no one could point to the fire. The plantation itself shifted in the wake of his death. The overseer stepped into command, his authority bolstered by the absence of the master's iron fist. But though he tried to maintain order, the weight of fear was different now. The lash cracked less often, not because of mercy, but because his presence lacked the same terrible gravity. Without the master's shadow looming over them, the slaves began to breathe differently. Their chains were not gone, but they felt lighter, as though the ghost of cruelty had been buried alongside the body. For Evelyn, the aftermath was more complicated. Outwardly, she remained unchanged. She polished the silver, lit the fires, carried trays to the overseer just as she had once carried them to the master. Her face betrayed nothing. Her voice gave no hint of what she had done. To the household, she was still invisible, but inside the silence grew heavy. She had imagined triumph. She had imagined release. She had imagined that the master's final gasp would bring a freedom sweeter than any dream. Instead, she felt something darker, emptiness. The revenge she had nurtured for years was complete, but it had not filled the hollow, carved by suffering. His death had ended his reign, but it had not erased the scars he left behind. She still bore them in her body and her mind, in the quiet nights when she closed her eyes and heard his voice in her memory, and yet she could not regret it. There was justice in what she had done, even if it was justice no law would recognize. His body lay in the ground now, rotting in the silence of a grave that no one visited. The land he had commanded, the house he had built on blood and cruelty, would continue. But he was gone, and she had carried him to that end with her own hand. That knowledge gave her a kind of power, cold and heavy but real. In the weeks that followed, the plantation settled into a strange new rhythm. The overseer's control kept the machinery turning, but the absence of the master was felt in every corner. The whole seemed quieter, the fields less tense. The servants spoke in hushed tones of the storm, of curses and omens. No one mentioned Evelyn. No one dared, and Evelyn herself carried on, her secret buried deeper than the master's body. She carried it not as a burden, but as a truth carved into her soul. She knew that she had become something more than a victim, something more than a servant. She had become the hand of vengeance, the shadow that struck when no one else would. And though her heart was still heavy with pain, she knew this too. His cruelty no longer defined her. His life was gone, and she had taken it. The world outside the plantation would never know the truth. The doctor's paper would carry the lie of a heart seizure. The overseer would rule with borrowed authority. The land would keep bleeding labor from the enslaved. But in the silent corners of history, Evelyn's act would remain. A story whispered, a rumor passed, a ghost that haunted the walls of the house long after the master was gone. The aftermath was not peace, but it was justice. The master's body rotted in the ground, but his absence lived on in the walls of the plantation. His death was both an ending and a beginning, a fracture in the timeline of suffering that could never quite be stitched shut. For Evelyn, it was the moment her life was divided in two. The years when she endured under his shadow, and the years when she lived with the shadow she herself had cast. But the question lingered. Heavy as storm air, what does vengeance truly give? In the weeks after his burial, silence filled the house. The whip cracked less often. Orders were barked with less conviction. The overseer kept the fields working, but his authority felt like an imitation of something larger. Fear, The true engine of the master's dominion had weakened. It was not gone, but it no longer ruled with the same suffocating power. And in the silence of the nights, Evelyn would lie awake and listen, not for his footsteps, not for his voice, not for the key turning in her door. Those horrors were gone. Instead, she listened to the sound of her own heart, beating steady in the dark, and she wondered if she had become freer or merely heavier. Because vengeance, for all its fire, leaves ashes. She carried his death like a secret talisman, one no one could ever see. If the overseer had suspected, if the doctor had doubted, if even a whisper of accusation had risen, she would have been dragged into the open, torn apart, made into a warning. But she had been careful. She had been silent. The truth remained hers alone. That secrecy made her powerful, but it also made her isolated. She could not confess to another soul, not even to the few she trusted. She could never lean to another woman in the fields and say, "I struck the master down." Such a truth could not be shared, because it was not just hers. It was dangerous to anyone who carried it. So Evelyn bore it quietly, wearing her silence like armor, her face an unreadable mask. Yet something changed in the eyes of the others. When she walked through the halls, some of the servants looked at her longer than before, their gazes curious, almost reverent. When she passed the fields, the workers straightened, their eyes flicking to her as though sensing something invisible around her. No one spoke, but the air carried a tension, an unspoken recognition that Evelyn was no longer just another woman enslaved. She was something else now, something hidden, something dangerous, something holy. Perhaps they didn't know exactly what she had done, but they felt it. And so the legacy of the act began, not in words, not in records, but in whispers, in glances, in the strange new hush that followed her. The plantation itself seemed altered. The old master's name was spoken less often, and when it was, it carried none of the force it once had. The great man who had once commanded land and bodies with an iron will was gone, and his memory was already fading. But Evelyn endured. Evelyn carried on. Evelyn remained. History has a way of erasing those like her. The books written in that time did not tell her story. The ledgers recorded names, numbers, births and deaths, but not the night a woman raised her hand in silence and ended the man who had tormented her. The newspapers might have reported the passing of a wealthy plantation owner, but they would have repeated the lie of a heart seizure, not the truth of a servant's vengeance. And yet, history is not just ink on paper, it is also the whispers passed in secret, the stories told around fires, the warnings murmured in kitchens, the rumors that cling to old houses long after their masters are gone. Evelyn's act became one of those stories, never openly spoken but never forgotten. For decades after, visitors to the plantation would hear servants mutter that the house was haunted. They claimed to hear footsteps in empty halls, the sound of a man choking in the night, the faint cry of a storm that never ended. Some said the master's ghost lingered, punished for his cruelty. Others whispered that it wasn't his ghost at all, it was hers, guarding the house, watching, ensuring no man like him would ever rise again. And so, Evelyn's vengeance became a legend, not the kind written in history books, but the kind that slips between the cracks, surviving in silence. But here is the deeper question, one that should haunt us still. Was she free? Yes, she struck him down. Yes, she ended his reign of cruelty. Yes, she carved a scar into the story of that place that would never fully heal. But she remained enslaved. Her body was still claimed by the plantation, her days still bound to labor, her nights still dictated by others. She did not escape into the north. She did not live to see emancipation. She lived and died within the same system that had broken her. So what, then, was her vengeance? Was it a triumph, or merely a brief spark in the darkness? Was it justice, or was it just a single death in a sea of suffering? Did her act ripple outward, inspiring others, shifting the weight of fear? Or did it fade into silence, known only to her and the shadows? Perhaps it was all these things at once. Perhaps that is the nature of vengeance. It satisfies, it wounds, it frees, it chains. It gives and it takes. Evelyn's act forces us to confront the reality of history's silence. How many other Evelyns existed? Their names lost, their acts erased, their stories buried under the weight of power. How many women endured what she endured, and how many took justice into their own hands in ways the record books never preserved? We may never know, but when we listen closely to the past, when we press our ears to its walls, we can still hear them. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of survival, of hidden resistance, of vengeance carried in whispers. Evelyn's legacy, then, is not just the death of her master. It is the reminder that history hides more than it reveals. It is the reminder that behind every statistic, every ledger, every cold line of ink, there are human lives, flesh, blood, pain, fury. It is the reminder that even in the darkest corners, even in the most suffocating oppression, there are moments when the powerless rise and strike, unseen but undeniable. And so the story ends where it began, in silence. But it is not the silence of submission. It is the silence of power, of a woman who knew her truth, carried it, and left it to haunt those who came after. As you hear her story now, ask yourself, how many more remain untold? How many shadows in history are not merely shadows, but women like Evelyn, unrecorded, unremembered, but not erased? And if the walls of history could speak, what screams, what whispers, what acts of hidden vengeance would they reveal?